There is a moment, unmistakable once it arrives, when Adam Schiff realizes that he has handed Mike Johnson the exact instrument Johnson needed to dismantle him. And it happens roughly 40 seconds into the hearing, immediately after Schiff delivers another polished attack involving January 6th, evidence, constitutional oaths, and the supposed hypocrisy of the man sitting across from him. It is a sharp opening, carefully designed for television, clipped into the familiar prosecutorial rhythm Schiff has used for years whenever a committee room becomes a campaign stage and a microphone becomes a fundraising device. His staff can practically write the donation appeal before he finishes speaking because that machinery has been running so long that the distance between accusation and solicitation has become shorter than the distance between two commercial breaks. That is the central weakness hiding beneath Schiff's confidence. Every hearing is treated like a campaign appearance. Every accusation is packaged as moral emergency, and every use of the word evidence seems to arrive with a payment link waiting 20 minutes behind it. Mike Johnson understands that pattern, and instead of defending himself against Schiff's January 6th attack, he opens a binder filled with dates, transcripts, television appearances, investigative conclusions, and fundraising records that turn Schiff's favorite word into the subject of the entire hearing. Adam Schiff enters the room exactly as expected, carrying himself with the controlled certainty of a former federal prosecutor who has spent decades learning how to frame a dispute before anyone else can define it. His jaw is fixed, his folder is tucked beneath his arm, and his posture communicates the same message he has communicated through years of hearings, press conferences, cable interviews, and committee confrontations. He is not entering a discussion, he is entering a prosecution. The hearing is formally presented as a Judiciary Committee oversight session concerning intelligence community reform. But Schiff knows that any room containing his record, the Russia investigation, and national television will inevitably become a referendum on the claims he made beginning in 2017. Now a senator, seated across from the side of the table he once controlled, Schiff moves first because controlling the first frame has always been one of his most reliable political weapons. He does not wait for Johnson to raise Russia, classified briefings, the censure vote, or the language Schiff repeatedly used on television. He attacks first, hoping that moral accusation will bury factual examination before it begins. Schiff's opening lasts roughly 4 minutes and arrives in the smooth, compressed cadence of someone who has delivered variations of the same argument hundreds of times. He says that he knows why he has been brought into the hearing, rejects the idea that the subject is merely intelligence reform, and claims that he is being targeted because the House censured him for warning Americans that a presidential campaign had been compromised by a foreign adversary. He says he stands by every word, then calls it ironic that Mike Johnson, a man who voted against certifying the 2020 election results, is presiding over a hearing concerning integrity, accountability, and the conduct of the intelligence community. The attack is clean, aggressive, and built to dominate the opening news clips because it shifts attention away from Schiff's factual record and toward Johnson's political history before Johnson has spoken a complete sentence. The room reacts exactly as Schiff expects, with the tense silence that follows a deliberate provocation, while his staff outside the room sees the familiar ingredients of another profitable confrontation already falling into place. Then Schiff uses the word Johnson has been waiting for: evidence. Johnson's expression does not show anger, embarrassment, or the defensive irritation Schiff appears to be trying to provoke. Instead, there is a brief flicker of recognition, the look of someone who has just heard an opponent voluntarily enter the only argument that matters. Johnson adjusts his glasses, opens the binder, and declines to spend his time debating January 6th, personal motives, partisan labels, or Schiff's theatrical suggestion that the integrity of the chair should replace the subject of the hearing. He says that the senator has used the word evidence. And because both men are lawyers, that word must be treated as a legal term rather than a campaign slogan, a cable news prop, or a convenient emotional trigger for small dollar donors. In that instant, Johnson strips away Schiff's preferred political framing and replaces it with a brutally narrow question. When Adam Schiff repeatedly said evidence, was he using the word with the precision expected of a prosecutor or with the flexibility expected of a fundraiser? Outside the room, Schiff's communications team immediately recognizes the danger because Johnson is not arguing over conclusions yet. He is defining the language that will control every conclusion that follows. A political disagreement can be escaped through rhetoric, reframed through motive, or buried beneath competing narratives, but a definition forces the speaker to choose between meanings, and each available meaning creates its own problem. Johnson begins reading dates and quotations from the binder with no visible urgency because he does not need outrage when Schiff's own words have already supplied the pressure. On March 22, 2017, Schiff appeared on CNN and declared that the evidence was not merely circumstantial, but direct, a phrase with a specific meaning that no competent lawyer could confuse with suspicion, inference, concern, or an unfinished assessment. On February 14, 2018, he told MSNBC that there was already ample evidence in the public domain concerning collusion, again presenting a conclusion rather than acknowledging an unresolved investigation. Johnson continues with an April 7, 2019 appearance on ABC News, where Schiff said that the evidence of collusion was in plain sight, language so absolute that it left no room for the defense he would later attempt to construct. 3 statements, 3 major networks, and 3 public declarations presented not as speculation, but as established fact, delivered by a man whose title and access encouraged viewers to assume that his certainty rested on information they could not see. Johnson places those declarations beside the findings that followed, not with theatrical outrage, but with the methodical discipline of someone comparing an answer sheet to the record. The Mueller report, released on April 18, 2019, stated that the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government. That conclusion did not erase every contact, political controversy, or investigative dispute, but it directly undercut the certainty Schiff had repeatedly sold as fact. Johnson then turns to the December 2019 findings of Inspector General Michael Horowitz, which identified at least 17 significant errors or omissions in the FISA applications connected to the investigation. The issue is no longer whether investigators had reasons to ask questions, because Schiff did not limit himself to saying questions existed. He said direct evidence existed, ample evidence existed, and evidence was visible in plain sight. In May 2023, Special Counsel John Durham concluded that the FBI had failed to uphold its obligation of strict fidelity to the law and had opened the investigation using raw, unanalyzed, and uncorroborated intelligence. Johnson does not need to pretend that Mueller, Horowitz, and Durham wrote identical reports or reached identical conclusions on every issue because the narrow point is far more damaging. None of those investigations validated the sweeping certainty Schiff repeatedly broadcast. Schiff spoke like a prosecutor announcing what the evidence proved, while the official findings exposed an investigative record filled with unverified claims, serious procedural failures, and conclusions far weaker than Schiff's television language suggested. This is where Johnson tightens the argument around Schiff's professional background because Adam Schiff cannot retreat into the excuse of being an ordinary political commentator unfamiliar with legal vocabulary. He is a former federal prosecutor who sent defendants to prison, argued from evidentiary records, distinguished allegation from proof, and understood that direct evidence is not decorative language added to make a television interview sound more urgent. He knew the difference between a lead and a fact, between intelligence and admissible evidence, between suspicion and proof, and between a public assessment and a declaration of certainty. More importantly, Schiff had access to classified intelligence briefings unavailable to the millions of Americans watching him on television, which meant the public was not evaluating his claims as equal participants in a debate. They were trusting him to accurately describe material they could not independently examine. That imbalance of access gave every confident word additional authority, and Schiff repeatedly converted that authority into declarations that later investigations did not substantiate. Johnson looks directly at Schiff and asks the question without wasting a syllable. When Schiff used the word evidence 212 times across 14 networks over 37 months, was he using the legal definition or some other definition created for political television? Schiff responds with the instinct of a prosecutor trapped by a narrow question, immediately attempting to broaden the field by attacking the Durham report, invoking intelligence professionals, and pointing to contacts described in the Mueller report. It is a familiar maneuver because once the discussion expands into every controversy surrounding Russia, campaigns, investigations, foreign contacts, and partisan interpretations, a precise contradiction can disappear inside a cloud of arguments. Johnson refuses to follow him there and returns to the single word, asking whether Schiff used evidence according to its legal meaning and demanding a direct answer. The simplicity of the question is what makes it destructive, because either Schiff admits that he used prosecutorial language loosely before millions of viewers, or he insists that he used it precisely and must explain why 3 major investigations failed to confirm the certainty he repeatedly expressed. Schiff begins to answer, stops, and tries again, briefly displaying the same hesitation that he has spent years forcing from witnesses sitting on the opposite side of congressional microphones. Johnson does not raise his voice, interrupt with a speech, or rescue Schiff by offering a less damaging version of the question. He simply allows the contradiction to remain visible. The man who built a national reputation demanding exact answers is now unable to provide one about the exact meaning of the word that powered his media career. At this stage, the binder has established the first half of Johnson's case. Schiff repeatedly presented unconfirmed claims with the vocabulary of legal certainty while possessing privileged access that encouraged the public to trust his declarations. Johnson then turns the page, leaving behind the question of what the word evidence meant and moving toward the far more dangerous question Schiff's team never expected to hear in that room. Exactly how much money was that word worth? Johnson turns the page and shifts from the meaning of the word evidence to the price attached to it, because calling Adam Schiff inaccurate is politically predictable, but demonstrating that those inaccuracies generated tens of millions of dollars is something entirely different. He introduces Brenda Holloway, a retired postal worker from Bakersfield, California, who spent 31 years carrying mail before retiring in 2020 on a pension of roughly $2,800 a month. Brenda watched MSNBC every night and began donating $25 each month to Schiff's campaign in 2018, eventually sending approximately $2,400 over 8 years because she believed he was the one public official telling the truth about what had happened. She did not possess a security clearance, did not attend classified briefings, and could not inspect the underlying intelligence herself. So her decision depended almost entirely on the credibility of a former federal prosecutor repeatedly declaring that direct evidence existed. Brenda was not buying access, influence, or a place at a private dinner. She was paying for certainty, and the certainty was packaged inside one legally charged word. Johnson then opens the Federal Election Commission filings and reads the numbers without decoration, because the numbers require no emotional assistance. During 2018, when Schiff's television appearances concerning evidence reached their most profitable intensity, his campaign raised approximately $14.3 million. In 2019, the same year the Mueller report failed to establish a conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russian government, Schiff raised another $12.7 million. In 2020, after the investigation had ended and the promised proof remained absent, the campaign collected approximately $16.4 million, demonstrating that the collapse of the underlying claim did not reduce the commercial value of the accusation. By then, evidence was no longer being used primarily to describe information. It had become a political brand, and brands can remain profitable long after the product beneath them has failed. Johnson proceeds to the second quarter of 2023 when the House censured Schiff for misleading the American people about the Russia investigation, and this is where the separation between accountability and fundraising becomes almost impossible to maintain. During the censure vote itself, not several days later and not after a period of reflection, Schiff's campaign distributed an urgent fundraising email claiming that MAGA Republicans were spreading false and defamatory lies and asking supporters to donate immediately. The campaign collected approximately $8.2 million that quarter, making the censure one of the most financially successful moments of Schiff's political career. The punishment for misleading the public was converted into another sales opportunity, and the accusation that he had misrepresented evidence became the reason donors were told to send more money. Schiff was censured because the promises surrounding the evidence had collapsed, yet the censure produced more revenue than the original promises, a perfect political business model in which both the claim and its exposure generated profit. Johnson connects those numbers back to Brenda because large totals can become abstract while $25 taken from a postal worker's monthly pension remains concrete. Brenda donated because Schiff told the public that evidence existed. She continued donating because she believed his access to classified material made his confidence trustworthy. And when Congress censured him, she was asked to send still more money to defend him from the consequences of the same claims. Her $25 became a tiny part of the $8.2 million collected during the censure quarter, meaning she paid once for the assertion and then paid again when the assertion was formally challenged. 3 investigations did not confirm the evidence she believed she was financing, but the fundraising operation never offered a refund, a correction, or even an admission that the language had outrun the record. Brenda paid for the claim, Brenda paid for the backlash, and Schiff's campaign profited from both transactions. The tone in the room changes when Johnson leaves political criticism behind and begins discussing the legal implications because the issue is no longer whether Schiff exaggerated in a television interview, but whether those exaggerations were used to obtain money. Schiff possessed access to classified intelligence while serving as chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, and those briefings contained information about the actual condition of the Russia investigation, including the limits, weaknesses, and unverified nature of the material being examined. His public statements presented certainty that the classified record did not support, according to the conclusions later reached by Mueller, Horowitz, and Durham. Those public statements then appeared beside fundraising solicitations that encouraged Americans to donate because Schiff supposedly knew the truth and was courageously revealing it against powerful opposition. Over 7 years, the campaign raised approximately $80 million while repeatedly linking Schiff's public identity, access, and credibility to the claim that the evidence existed. Johnson cites 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, the federal wire fraud statute, and carefully describes the elements without formally accusing Schiff of committing a crime. A wire fraud theory requires a scheme to defraud, a material misrepresentation, the use of electronic communications, and an intent to obtain money, and Johnson methodically places the known facts beside those elements. Television appearances and campaign emails supplied the electronic communications, the fundraising receipts supplied the money, and the repeated assertion that direct evidence existed supplied the alleged misrepresentation. The hardest question is intent, but Schiff's access to classified briefings makes that question unavoidable because he was not merely repeating a newspaper headline or sharing a theory formed from public reporting. He was invoking certainty while privately reviewing information the audience could not see, and that asymmetry is precisely what gave his claims their fundraising power. Johnson makes clear that he is not acting as a prosecutor and is not announcing a criminal conclusion, because the purpose of the argument is to show that the facts deserve examination rather than to stage another empty accusation. He notes that a former commissioner of the Federal Election Commission reviewed a complaint involving Schiff and publicly concluded that there was unquestionably enough evidence to justify a civil investigation and enough for the Department of Justice to seriously consider a criminal inquiry. That does not establish guilt, but it demolishes Schiff's attempt to dismiss the matter as nothing more than partisan disagreement, because professionals familiar with campaign finance law saw a genuine legal question rather than a rhetorical dispute. The American public spent approximately $32 million funding the Mueller investigation in an effort to determine whether the promised evidence existed. Schiff raised approximately $80 million while telling the country that it already did. The comparison is devastating because it exposes the incentives with arithmetic rather than ideology. $32 million to search for evidence, $80 million for repeatedly claiming the evidence had already been found. The official investigation carried the burden of legal standards, documentation, verification, internal review, and public accountability, while Schiff's television appearances carried none of those restraints, yet generated more than twice as much money. When investigators failed to establish conspiracy, the fundraising machine did not slow down, because the product was never the final proof. The product was the permanent promise that proof existed somewhere beyond public reach. Every delay could be framed as obstruction, every contrary finding could be described as corruption, and every challenge could be transformed into a new emergency donation appeal. The absence of confirmation was not a commercial weakness in Schiff's model. It was the fuel that allowed the campaign to keep selling access to a revelation that never had to arrive. Johnson removes his glasses and cleans them slowly before returning to Brenda Holloway, not as a sentimental distraction, but as the human cost of a system built on professional authority. Brenda sent $2,400 because she believed that a former prosecutor would use evidence the way prosecutors are expected to use it, precisely, carefully, and honestly. Her trust was worth $2,400 to her, while the same trust multiplied across millions of donors was worth approximately $80 million to Schiff. The difference between those numbers is the difference between one retired worker making a sacrifice and a national campaign monetizing a word whose legal meaning its own candidate understood better than almost anyone watching. Johnson says that when a student at the school where he taught sold incorrect test answers while knowing they were wrong, the school did not call it fundraising, it called it cheating, and the student was expelled. Schiff immediately rises to fight back because he has spent his career cross-examining witnesses, redirecting hostile questions, and refusing to allow an opponent's framing to remain uncontested. He argues that Johnson is describing a political disagreement rather than a legal violation, insists that he offered an assessment of the evidence available at the time, and says reasonable people can differ over the weight and significance of intelligence. He condemns the wire fraud comparison as an abuse of the hearing and an insult to every lawyer in the room, attempting to move the issue away from whether his words were accurate and toward whether Johnson's accusation is excessive. It is an experienced defense because replacing false declaration with reasonable assessment transforms potential deception into ordinary judgment and turns certainty into interpretation after the fact. Johnson listens, nods, and allows Schiff to finish, because the word assessment is not an escape route at all. It is the next trap waiting inside the binder. Johnson seizes on the word assessment because Schiff has finally offered the defense he needs, and that defense collapses under Schiff's own language almost immediately. An assessment is what someone gives when the information remains incomplete, when a doctor weighs symptoms when an analyst considers probabilities, or when an investigator explains what the available facts may suggest. Schiff did not go on CNN and say that his assessment was that evidence might exist, nor did he tell MSNBC that certain intelligence appeared consistent with possible coordination. He said the evidence was direct, he said ample evidence already existed, and he said the evidence of collusion was in plain sight, each statement presented as a declaration rather than a provisional judgment. A former federal prosecutor cannot hide three categorical claims inside the softer word assessment simply because the investigations ended without validating the certainty he sold. Johnson explains the distinction with the cold patience of someone correcting a legal argument that should never have been made by a trained prosecutor. When a doctor says the patient may have pneumonia, the doctor is acknowledging uncertainty, but when the doctor says the laboratory result is direct proof, the statement carries a completely different professional meaning. Schiff chose the strongest available vocabulary while possessing access to classified material that ordinary viewers could not evaluate, then relied on that same access to make his confidence appear authoritative. 3 independent investigations later exposed a record built on unverified intelligence, procedural failures, and conclusions that did not support the sweeping language Schiff repeatedly used. That is not a harmless difference in interpretation. It is a man with privileged information telling the public one thing while the underlying record pointed somewhere far less certain. Schiff sits down, not dramatically and not in surrender, but with the involuntary restraint of a lawyer who has just heard his own defense restated more accurately by opposing counsel. The word assessment was supposed to create distance between certainty and intent, allowing Schiff to recast years of declarations as reasonable judgments made during a complicated investigation. Johnson instead shows that Schiff's precise words eliminated that distance before the defense was ever offered, because is direct evidence cannot honestly be rewritten years later as I was expressing a tentative assessment. Schiff's professional experience makes the contradiction worse, not better, since he knew exactly how prosecutors distinguish evidence from allegation and certainty from inference. The escape hatch closes because Schiff built it from language that his own public record refuses to support. Johnson opens the final section of the binder and announces that he wants to display correlation rather than claim causation, a distinction Schiff himself would demand in any serious evidentiary proceeding. A chart appears on the hearing room screen with one line tracking the number of Schiff's monthly television appearances in which he used the word evidence, and another line tracking campaign receipts during those same periods. The lines rise together, fall together, and peak together with a visual closeness that makes the relationship immediately understandable without another speech. When Schiff appeared more frequently and repeated the claim more aggressively, the money increased, and when the television activity declined, the fundraising totals followed. Johnson does not need to call the chart proof of a crime because its narrower message is already brutal. The word evidence functioned as inventory, and every broadcast created another opportunity to sell it. Brenda Holloway watched those appearances, believed the authority behind them, and sent her $25 because she assumed Schiff's certainty reflected facts hidden from public view. Multiply Brenda by roughly 2.4 million individual donors, and the small monthly sacrifices become an $80 million political operation built around one recurring promise. The promise was not that an investigation was underway, because everyone already knew that. The promise was that Schiff possessed knowledge confirming what the investigations had not yet established. Each television declaration strengthened that impression, each fundraising email converted the impression into urgency, and each donation rewarded the campaign for keeping the accusation alive. The chart exposes the machinery without needing to accuse anyone of pulling a lever, because the two lines move together like a product demonstration conducted in real time. Johnson closes the binder, removes his glasses, folds them carefully, and returns to Schiff's opening attack concerning evidence, oaths, and irony. He agrees that irony belongs in the hearing, but locates it somewhere Schiff never intended, inside the career of a man who spent 7 years insisting that public officials must answer for every misleading statement. Schiff demanded investigations, accountability, legal precision, and the highest possible standard for anyone entrusted with power. Yet, he repeatedly used a word he understood as a prosecutor in ways the official record did not sustain. He sold that word to millions of Americans, collected approximately $80 million while selling it, and continued converting every challenge into another opportunity to request money. The evidence never became the product because the campaign did not need the evidence. It needed the word, the suspense surrounding the word, and donors willing to pay for its promised meaning. Johnson returns one final time to Brenda, the retired postal worker in Bakersfield, living on a $2,800 monthly pension and sending $25 because she believed a prosecutor would speak precisely. She is still waiting for the direct evidence Schiff said existed, the ample evidence he said was already public, and the evidence he claimed was visible in plain sight. She will keep waiting because the official investigations never delivered what Schiff's language promised, while the campaign kept every dollar collected from people who trusted that promise. Her money existed, the fundraising totals existed, the television appearances existed, and the email sent during Schiff's own censure vote existed. The one thing that never appeared in the form Schiff repeatedly declared was the evidence itself. The chairman asks whether Schiff wishes to make a closing statement, and Schiff responds with 2 polished minutes about the rule of law, democratic oversight, institutional courage, and the responsibility to speak truth to power. He does not mention the $80 million, does not address Brenda Holloway, does not explain the synchronized lines on the chart, and does not discuss the fundraising email sent while the House was censuring him. He returns to the language that has protected him for years, the elevated vocabulary of principle, duty, democracy, and accountability, hoping abstraction can erase the arithmetic left on the screen. This time, the familiar words sound less like a moral defense than a marketing script, because Johnson has spent the hearing exposing the timing, incentives, and revenue behind them. Schiff continues speaking in the language of public service, but the room has already been shown the private commercial value attached to every declaration. Johnson offers no final outburst, no victory speech, and no attempt to compete with Schiff's closing performance. He straightens the binder, places his pen beside it, checks the clock, and lets the record remain where it has landed after 43 minutes. In that time, the word evidence has been removed from Schiff's control and returned to its legal meaning in front of millions of viewers. A former school teacher from Shreveport has forced a former federal prosecutor from Burbank to confront the vocabulary he spent years using as both accusation and commodity. The hearing ends without Schiff answering the simplest question of the night, whether the word meant what a prosecutor knows it means when he repeatedly sells it as certainty. In the hallway, Schiff's communications director stares at the fundraising email he began drafting during the opening statement, another automatic appeal built around the familiar message that political enemies were attacking Schiff again. The subject line is ready, the urgency is familiar, and the donation mechanism would almost certainly work because it has worked after investigations, censures, hearings, and television confrontations for years. He deletes the draft, not because the machine has suddenly become ineffective, but because Johnson has allowed the audience to look inside it and see the timing between the accusation, the outrage, and the solicitation. Once the public has watched the machinery operate, every future appeal carries the visible outline of the gears behind it. The email disappears from the screen, but the chart, the binder, the $80 million, and the word that connected them are already spreading far beyond the hearing room. The first clip to spread beyond the hearing room is not Johnson's cheating comparison, not the $80 million total, and not the moment Schiff struggles to define the word that built his public reputation. It is the chart, two lines moving almost together, one tracking television appearances using evidence, the other tracking fundraising receipts. The image needs no partisan narrator because the audience sees the relationship immediately. Every rise in exposure is followed by a rise in donations, and every decline in appearances is mirrored by a decline in receipts. Within 72 hours, the clip reaches approximately 26 million views because the message is simple. The word was not information, it was inventory. The second clip reaches roughly 17 million views and centers on the definition trap when Schiff calls his statements an assessment and Johnson reads the declarations back to him. An assessment admits uncertainty, while the evidence is direct and the evidence is in plain sight announce certainty. The exchange moves through legal circles, law school forums, prosecutors' networks, and defense attorneys' discussions because trained lawyers understand why the distinction matters. A former United States attorney notes that if one of his prosecutors had used direct evidence in an unsupported filing, both the filing and prosecutor would have been pulled. Schiff's problem is no longer merely partisan because people who understand evidentiary language are examining his words and reaching the same conclusion. During the first week, Schiff's office releases a statement describing the hearing as partisan revisionist history and defending his interpretation of the intelligence. The statement also invokes the First Amendment, a defense that may be legally relevant but is politically disastrous because it answers the wrong question. Johnson never argued that Schiff lacked the right to speak. He argued that Schiff used the authority of a prosecutor and intelligence chairman to present uncertain material as evidence, then used that certainty to raise money. Saying political speech is protected does not prove the speech was accurate, and saying a fundraising claim was lawful does not make it honest. Legal and truthful are different words, and the hearing has shown what happens when Schiff blurs one definition into another. Campaign finance watchdogs then ask the Federal Election Commission to examine the relationship between Schiff's television appearances and fundraising solicitations. The requests cite Johnson's chart and ask whether repeated claims about evidence, paired with donation appeals, could constitute solicitation through material misrepresentation. The FEC dismissed a similar complaint in 2022 after a 3-3 deadlock, but the commission is no longer guaranteed to divide the same way. A complaint does not prove a violation, but Schiff's claim that the matter is partisan becomes harder to maintain when independent watchdogs ask the same question. The chart has transformed rhetorical criticism into a regulatory issue, and regulatory questions often survive after television outrage fades. During the second week, the Senate Ethics Committee receives a referral from a nonpartisan organization requesting a preliminary review of Schiff's fundraising practices. The referral asks whether fundraising communications contained claims inconsistent with the classified intelligence available to Schiff, and whether any inconsistency violated Senate ethics rules concerning honest communication with donors. It is not an investigation or finding of guilt, but Schiff understands the significance, because he spent years arguing that the origin of an inquiry does not erase the duty to examine facts. The request arrives without cable panels or theatrical energy. It simply asks whether the man who demanded accountability from everyone else used the same standard while his campaign collected money. Legal analysts begin debating the wire fraud theory, and the consensus across different panels is cautious but not dismissive. Most acknowledge that Johnson identified possible elements, including electronic communications, alleged material misrepresentations, fundraising receipts, and a possible scheme to obtain money. They also emphasize that proving criminal intent in a political speech case would be extraordinarily difficult, especially if Schiff argues that he genuinely believed his interpretation. Difficult, however, is not impossible, and impossible is the only word that would allow him to dismiss the discussion entirely. Once again, One word carries the argument, and this time the word is not evidence, but intent. During the third week, Brenda Holloway appears on a Bakersfield television station, seated at her kitchen table with a Truth Matters magnet on the refrigerator. She says she sent $25 every month because Schiff claimed he had evidence, and she believed him because he had classified access while she had only a pension and television screen. When the investigations failed to confirm his promises, she continued donating because she assumed the investigations were wrong and Schiff was right. Then she says the sentence, Schiff's campaign cannot answer. He was not right, and she cannot get her money back. The clip reaches roughly 5 million views because Brenda is not a strategist or lawyer. She is the ordinary donor whose trust made the machine profitable. Millions of other donors watch Brenda and recognize the humiliation of paying for something that never arrives, not because they bought a product, but because they bought certainty from a man whose background made certainty sound credible. The word evidence does not disappear from Schiff's vocabulary, and the fundraising emails eventually resume because political machinery rarely stops when the public sees its gears. But the word no longer sounds clean or authoritative because every future use carries the chart, the censure email, the $80 million total in Brenda's kitchen. Schiff can still say it, his campaign can still monetize it, and supporters can still believe him. The audience, however, has seen the transaction beneath the declaration, and once a political word is exposed as a product, it never fully returns to being evidence. That is the final damage Johnson inflicts without needing a verdict, charge, or dramatic closing accusation. He does not prove in 43 minutes that Adam Schiff committed wire fraud, and he does not need to because the narrower conclusion is severe enough. Schiff repeatedly used prosecutorial language to sell certainty. Official investigations failed to confirm the certainty he sold, and the fundraising operation collected approximately $80 million while keeping the promise alive. The distance between what donors believed and what the record established was 7 years long, millions of people wide, and measured in monthly contributions from people like Brenda Holloway. Johnson gives that distance a name. The word was evidence, and the word had been sold.